welcome to our panel on the future of Ember. As I said, this setup reminds me a bit of one of those TV duels you would have before elections. Like, explain your vision for the Ember project in case you become Chancellor of Ember. And then you're the people who get to vote later. But no, that's not what we're doing, of course. We want to talk about the future of Ember. And we are joined here. I think everybody knows everyone. Anyway, I'm going to quickly say it again. Chris Manson from simplabs, who also spoke yesterday. Ed Faulkner from Cardstack, and as well independent,
yes.
I think.
Yes, a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Representing Ember Framework team, yeah.
Oh yeah, right, sure. That's kind of the main thing here. And then we have Preston Sego joining us remotely. He just gave his talk right before this panel, basically. And then we have Tom Dale remotely as well. So
hey everyone, how y'all doing?
When I was thinking about how we could talk about the future of Ember, I thought what could be a better way to talk about the future than talk about the past first, right? So we want to start by looking back at sort of like maybe not all of the history of Ember, but maybe like the recent past. Like what have been the most important things that happened in the Ember community, the most important changes in the framework that happened like in the past 1-2 years or so maybe that will have an impact on the near future as well. So I would say we just go one by one and everybody sort of explains their thoughts. So maybe Chris could start.
Yeah, so recent past. I think I'm happy that I'm going first here, so I get to say the obvious thing, which is Ember Octane has been a really big thing, I think, personally, for the Ember community. Like, I've been using Ember for 10 years in December this year, so that's a long time to be saying you're using a single JavaScript framework. But the change that we've had with Ember Octane has felt slightly different because it's felt like not only have we changed a lot of the guts and the things, how we actually use the framework, we're changing how we want people to think about it and how we want, especially new developers, the wider JavaScript community, to interact with Ember. And as somebody who is on the Ember core learning team and somebody who cares a lot about marketing Ember in various different ways, Octane has made the story of communicating Ember much, much easier. Like, still have a lot of work to do to get everything transferred over, and we already had conversations today about large legacy apps that haven't changed every single one of their components over. So we're still in this 2 years later mode of moving to Octane. But I still think it's been very impactful and a very good thing for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I could riff on that. I think I agree, and that's the areas of stuff that excite me as well. Not strictly on technical feature capability, like that's all exciting, of course. But as I mentioned a little yesterday, just the social cultural aspects also of refining our understanding so much that we can really boil things down and need less concepts, need fewer ideas, just to be that much more accessible, right? And I think that it's hard in the JavaScript world. It has always been hard to tell long-term stories mostly because it's of the growth in the JavaScript. As a expanding galaxy, it just has grown and grown and grown. It's not slowing down. And what that means is that every year, there's like a vast new crop of beginners who enter programming for the first time and JavaScript for the first time. And so at any point in the last 10 years of Ember, you could have said, like, what's the average tenure of a JavaScript developer? And it's never gone up, right? It's always about a year. Because if you're doubling the size of your ecosystem every year, half the people are new all the time, right? And so that creates this like eternal beginner problem in all of JavaScript. This isn't an Ember specific thing at all. So that's one of the really cool things about JavaScript, I think, right? That it's accessible and it brings so many people in without a whole lot of barrier to getting started. Everybody's got JavaScript sitting in their web browser all the time. but it makes our design problem that much more challenging. And that's why I find it fun to try to distill a whole lot of wisdom that you get once you've been working in programming for a long time on best practices and how to plan for the future and write code that will last and stand the test of time, to just try to distill those best practices for people who are just starting out, right? And a framework that can really speak to both ends of that spectrum is a hard thing to make, and it's why I'm interested in working on it, because it's a hard problem that's fun from a technical design perspective, and it's a important problem because it serves a lot of people.
I echo what has been said before, but I think so. Like, I kind of started with Octane, like not 3.16 Octane, but like the beginning parts of it when you were still like literal bleeding edge. Things will break, and so that's like my frame of reference. So for me, the things that are most exciting are like not just its release, but I think the biggest release we've had since then is 3.25. And I think, so like I'm primarily an add-on author and tinkerer in my day-to-day as well as out in the open. And I think for add-on authors, whether you're just splitting add-ons internally at your company or in open source, 3.25 enables a lot of new design patterns with like local modifiers, local helpers, just treating everything as a value and being able to call this dot component or this dot whatever helper. It just enables a lot of design patterns that I've wanted for a very long time. And then also recently resources, very excited about those.
And of course we want to hear what Tom thinks as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it's got to be Octane. It's got to be track properties, right? And I think that's what you're hearing from the group for a very good reason. And I will say my frame of reference is a bit longer than Preston's, and I just I had an experience recently where at LinkedIn we've been migrating all of our applications over to Octane, and it's been making fantastic progress, and we're seeing a ton of benefit in terms of performance, the readability of the code. People's ability to onboard. It's just been a huge success. And I'll be honest, I had a moment where it was like 9 p.m. at night, and I don't know what I was doing, but I just opened up the code base for LinkedIn.com, and I was reading through the code. And I'll be honest, like I had a bit of an emotional moment, because I think we've all had the experience of where we have an idea in our head, and as programmers, we try to make it real, and it's not quite what we had in our head, right? And in that moment, 9 p.m., sitting there reading all this code that other people had written, I had this sensation of like, we had finally achieved in Ember what Yehuda and I had in our heads in a small room hacking in San Francisco in 2011, right? Like finally, the ecosystem, the community, the technology, the JavaScript as a language had caught up, and we were able to express with such pure clarity of syntax and semantics what we were trying to get across. And I don't mean to claim like we had Octane in our heads in 2011, right? Like obviously not. But what we were trying to get to, like that ease of use, those aesthetics. And Davert had that tweet a week or two ago about Ember and Glimmer components being really a data-driven component library. And I think that it was such a beautiful encapsulation of what we're going for here, because I've spent time with Svelte and Vue and React and a lot of these other technologies. And I think that, it's been a while, but in this case, Ember is really leading the industry. Like I think that our change tracking model, our programming model, I still think foundationally is the best. And of course there's trade-offs with everything. And I'm just really excited to see where, like, it's such a strong foundation for us to build on. And I think if we can just get that message out there, I just look at an example of the Glimmer component, the way that you author it, especially at scale, I still think it's like one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think all of the Ember community can agree that like the Octane model is like a huge improvement over what we had before, and we are now like in a very good situation with that. Right? I would like to come to a point that was kind of planned for later on, but you mentioned it already, Tom. how do we get the word out there, right? Like, how do we convince more people outside of the Ember community that Octane is like a really nice programming model and something you can be very productive with. And I think that has been quite a big challenge in the Ember world, like for quite some time, but I'm sure people also have ideas like for how we could overcome that, or how can we get better with that in the future. So I would say let's do the same round again.
Sure.
Start with Chris.
So I'm going to prefix my answer with a little comment that we need every solution that anybody suggests here. Like, everything that we say will be right. We should try everything to try and get the word out there. And I'm specifically saying that so that what I'm doing is also right. If you follow me on Twitter, if you see me on Twitch, I do Twitch streaming nowadays on Thursday mornings. Follow me. Smash that like button. The thing that I'm trying to do with that is not just to play on Twitch and do stuff. I want to show people that it's actually really accessible to build Ember apps. So one of the things I try and put across when I'm talking about what I'm doing, I'm writing a template, it's like, oh, this looks very much like HTML. And if I want to add Ember-y things, it's only a little light sprinkling over the HTML that I'm doing. And I've had people on. Anne was on my Twitch stream and kind of participates in the chat. And it's like, when I'm developing Ember apps on Twitch, I'm just using HTML and CSS with a little bit of JavaScript. And most of the time, I don't even create a JavaScript backing class for a component that I'm building. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to achieve right now, which is just be out there, be visible, show people what it looks like to build an Ember app. Because 90% of the time when you ask somebody, oh, what do you think of Ember? They refer to things that were 1X series, like it feels like 100 years ago. That's not what Ember is anymore.
Yeah.
So we need to show people what Ember is in 2021.
Yeah. I do think there's definitely precedent in technology industry of, for lack of a better word, underdog technologies that last a very long time with their own strong core, coming into their own much later than their critics said they could have. And, I think a wonderful open source technology I respect is Postgres as a database. Mm-hmm. And it was not the popular choice. All the cool kids wanted to only use MySQL. And all of the serious businesses wanted to use Oracle, right? And Postgres was kind of the nerdy, weird option for a long time. But I always stuck by Postgres because I respected their engineering vision. I respected their deep technology choices. And it made them move more slowly because they did things correctly. And now Postgres is in a very stable and successful place and has, I think, a lot of respect in the technology world, and it gets used very heavily. And that's the path I see us on. I think that, for one thing, you have to compartmentalize too, of course. I think that we have many jobs to do in our community, and there's lots of ways to contribute. And so I can't go crazy thinking too hard about external facing messaging when I'm head down on other parts of the thing. And I'm really glad other people are helping contribute in that way. So for me, I'm excited to be able to tell more stories and get more people in. I'm also but also deliberately detached from that outcome in the sense of just actual absolute usage. Like the absolute amount of Ember code in the world is going up still, absolutely. There's many Ember developers. There's lots of people working on it. I think it's very easy to bias ourselves with our own perceptions of what is going on in the technology world. It's just much bigger than any of us can see. So I like to take kind of a humble attitude of, most of what's going on out there we don't see, we don't hear from. The average developer in the world is not coming to conferences. They're not even speaking to us. There's these weird little pockets that when you stumble upon one, it's just amazing to see how much of our technology is out there being used by real people in real situations. And I've had multiple occasions where just through luck, bumped into people and talked to them about their technology and found out that there was this whole little ecosystem in a region I didn't know about or in an industry I didn't know about, building very valuable stuff that, of course, you don't hear about if you're not their customer, right? It's a very big world. So that's probably how I stay happy and don't worry too much. It's like, it's a very big world and our piece of it's still growing, even though our piece of it is small in the grand universe of things. I do think that, like I said, I'm glad that our community tries to recognize all kinds of contribution, and one of the most important ones is teaching and marketing. In the best kind of marketing is teaching. Right? It's giving people new capabilities and helping them understand their problems. And the fact that they end up using what you're suggesting is the icing on the cake. But you're actually just legitimately making a connection with them and teaching them something they didn't know how to do before. So our teaching aspects of the community are such a valuable piece of the contributions, and there's a lot of people helping on that front. And I definitely would encourage anybody who's like on the edge of being a contributor to the community or is new but wants to find a way to get involved, like getting involved on the teaching side of things by joining the learning team, or even just picking up a few open projects with the learning team, is a wonderful way to give back to the whole community. And that is one of our most publicly facing things. I think that if the most natural marketing of a JavaScript project or any software is like amazingly good teaching materials, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's an area where like people who contribute to that, we value them all tremendously. I value those contributions. I hope other people realize that and feel that that's a very first-class way to contribute. It's not like lesser than making a PR to like the Glimmer VM. It's at least as important, if not more important, to make a PR to the docs that teaches something that was confusing to you. So that's like the most meat and potatoes basic kind of marketing for any kind of software.
What do you think, Tom?
So these are my personal opinions, of course. But I think if we think back to the origins of Ember, we had this vertically integrated stack, if you will, that gave you a tremendous amount of capabilities out of the box. And in many cases, even if you wanted to assemble your own stack, it was very difficult to get something like that was that integrated, that worked that well together and had that rich of capabilities with like Ember Data and the router. Given how long the framework has been around, I think we spent the past few years, frankly, playing catch up a little bit, because the industry shifts and we have to make sure that we're keeping up with that technological advance. And as I see it, I think we've got that foundation, as I said, to a really strong place, perhaps one of the strongest in the industry. But a lot of the value prop that made people choose Ember in the beginning, frankly, has been commoditized. And I think, frankly, I think for the next generation of Ember, we haven't yet found that killer app that makes it a slam dunk to make people say, yeah, I want to use Ember for that. Because even if they look at a Glimmer component and they see that's a really nice API, and I can see that that's quite a bit more expressive than especially something that's using like all these React hooks, and it's really hard to understand. You look at it, be like, that's nice, but it seems like React has all the momentum. It's easier to hire React developers. We already have this existing Vue app or React app. That switching cost is so high. And I think what I've seen is you really have to come up with some new use case where Ember is just obviously so much better for that. And I don't know what that is. Of course, I've got some ideas that I'm not ready to talk about, but I think we need to find that thing that says like, wow, Ember is really the best for that specific problem. And I don't think we've got it there. But here's the good news. The good news is the browser has gotten so much more capable. And today we are still like little babies at taking advantage of it, right? When I think about web workers, when I think about IndexedDB, when I think about WebAssembly, there has been so much radical innovation, and the pace of JavaScript frameworks has not, it's improved, but it hasn't kept to that wild pace. So there's just so much raw, unmined material in the browser for a framework to come along and package it all together and say, this is how we write web applications now. And no one's done that yet, and I think that's a huge opportunity for Ember.
Preston, I know you are very vocal on Twitter about Ember and sort of engage in conversations and sort of hold up the Ember flag? Is that like sort of your grassroots contribution to getting the words out?
I mean, maybe. I would like everyone to kind of do the same thing though. So like I'm easily excitable about new and shiny things that might not be ready for businesses. But like, I don't know, like I think everyone can get excited, and people like to share in that excitement. So like, it doesn't matter how little it is, or if you think like, oh, this other framework has this, no one's going to care. Like, if you're excited about it, you should share it, because people like being around or reading about people being happy. And I think that's super important. Something that I have tried to do and I'm not very good at is, like, as I encounter problems, either with things coworkers come across or something I come across, I would like to start writing about it and then posting it somewhere. That could be on my Empress blog. That could be on Stack Overflow. Something else that I like doing that I'm not very good at, and I think maybe other people might have more energy than me to do, is to like go through Stack Overflow answers, and like if you find something out of date, and you're like, hey, this is a really old question, but like, I know this isn't the answer to the question asked, but this is how you would solve it in 2021, and it looks a little different, and this could help you should the algorithm bring you here.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let me say one other thing, Marco.
Yeah.
I had this English teacher in high school, and if you had a single misspelling or grammatical mistake on your essay that you turned in, he would give you an F. He would fail you.
Wow.
And he said a typo or a misspelling or grammar error, it's like, I don't care how beautiful and perfect your essay is. It's like having armpit stains in your wedding dress, right? It ruins the whole thing, no matter how beautiful the dress is. And I think one of the problems we had with Ember adoption was we had a lot of armpit stains in our wedding dress, right? So we had all this great stuff, but then people would come and use it, and they would see stuff that felt really out of date. It felt weird, and it felt foreign. And I really think about Octane was really about like taking our wedding dress to the dry cleaner and getting it cleaned, right? So even though we might have some, like, we have so much, we have such a long runway now to build on, because I think, with a few exceptions, I think we all agree about like controllers and query params, right? Like, there's maybe a few more small stains to get out. But largely, we've created this very modern system. And now when people come into it, their immediate gut reaction is not like, oh, this is gross or weird. It's like, oh, this is really cool and really beautiful. And that's such a strong position to be in. And it's a great foundation to build on.
And we talked about Octane a few times now, but there's already like the new edition on the horizon, right? Polaris has been mentioned a few times already. And I would like all of you to share a bit about what is going to be in there, or what you think needs to be in there. Sort of, what are the next things that should be coming for Ember, sort of to make it better in the future? What are the most like high impact things, maybe even, right? If we add this and this and this, we get to like convince more people, or sort of like show the value that Ember has to more people. Maybe not necessarily the same order.
Sure, I could go first. I think. A lot of the stuff is themes that have already come up, and I have also brought up in our talks yesterday and things. But in my mind, there's a few just like definitely things that should definitely be in the next edition, and then there's the kind of more stretch goals for the exciting things we think we could put in the next edition. So, the kind of stuff that's already in flight and beginning to land now is necessarily would find a home in the next edition, right? Because Octane is not, for example, all natively on modules, natively based off of an embroider build, right? It still has a lot of the On the build time side in node land, a lot of legacy machinery. And so whatever the next edition is going to be the one that doesn't have all of that, right? That simplifies that piece and eliminates that other barrier to people's understanding and people's adoption. So like that's in my head one of the like non-negotiables. The next edition is going to have that problem fixed. I think that like an iteration of the router APIs would be the next thing on my hit list as like really belongs in the next one. There's a lot that I don't think there's a need to wholesale throw away anything we've got. I think there's just again there's opportunity to come and align it with the things we did in Octane. You know, the router APIs didn't really have to change in Octane. That's a good thing. It meant our adoption story for the existing community was stronger. It means that those patterns they stand the test of time enough that they still work under Octane, but they could take advantage of Octane more, right? So when we think about how, you know, if you had auto tracking when you designed query params, how would you have done it, right? Like there's a lot of basic things like that that could make life nicer for us. So that iteration on routing, giving the routing system more love, and connecting it back to all the concepts that are in the Octane layer, and also connected to the build layer, because along with that, like every Ember app out of the box with using Ember's conventional routing and Ember's conventional build system should code split, right? Like there are Ember apps today in production using Ember to code split, but we want to make that the default and make it natural with the routing and not something you have to opt into. So that kind of stuff is, I think, basic stakes for what I would go in the next edition in my mind. The stretch goal stuff is more like, you know, there's lots of exciting possibilities for ways to leapfrog how applications are made. I'm, of course, focused very much on the build tooling side of life, and so I would love to do like the kind of instant builds I demoed in my EmberConf video as a Polaris feature. It's like out of the box Ember apps have like zero build cost almost, and you have this fantastic feedback loop. And maybe even ideas similar to what Preston was just showing us, because that's a similar concept, right? Doing more interactively in the browser is a thing that I think the programming world is getting socialized to. It's not as big a sell as it would have been 2 years ago or 5 years ago. You certainly see startups funding effort to try to do things like Stackblitz, but there's a lot of variations on how that goes. And there's a lot of variations on how well it integrates with what you're comfortable with already, and how flexible new kinds of working can be integrating with the existing ways of working, because it can be hard to get buy-in to move an entire organization to a completely new actual workflow process of how they write software. But if you can incrementally adopt it in small groups and you could get a better experience, I'm excited about helping revolutionize the way apps get built that way. I think, for example, people underestimate the value of how nice it would be if, when you're on your production website and you're a developer of that website, if you literally hit an extra hotkey and you now have a full environment to change 2 lines in a component somewhere and have it working in your copy of the app, right, with no friction at all, and then literally be like, yeah, that's good. Push the PR button, and that changes now a PR, right? That kind of thing, I don't think anybody here who's working on a product has that feature on their roadmap. It seems too far out, but I don't see, it would deliver huge value, right? That's just, when Tom talks about mining what's possible, and because browsers are so good now, that's the stuff I think of right away. And I would love to push on those kind of technologies much more, because it does the thing I was saying earlier. It serves a very broad set of people. When you sit down with somebody who says, like, I want to learn to make websites like you do, what should we do first? There's a huge amount of minutia that we forget about when we do it all the time, but how much of that can we eliminate? How much of that friction can we take away? I love to see teams where somebody from a designer background makes successful PRs, right? And Ember apps, to be successfully, I've seen that in Ember teams, which is a great thing about being HTML first. Can we make that even easier? Can we make it more integrated into the experience so that there's not even a barrier of teaching Git, right? All of that is big picture thinking stuff, And I'm not one to think that we should throw away tried and true culture in how programmers work. We need to, that's why it's an interesting design problem. Right? How do you give the power and control and discipline that advanced engineering teams need while also being inviting to beginners? And I think web browsers are such a powerful technology that every user has that gives them, we can start to give them little bits of capability that only advanced development teams have today. And I'm excited about that kind of stuff as my stretch goal, exciting things that could really be something truly fresh and new that people aren't even thinking about as a goal for their web application frameworks.
Chris, maybe?
Yeah, I kind of wish I went first on that one because I'm much more easily pleased on what I'm looking forward to. And it's not nearly as lofty as the goals that you listed out there. Essentially, like my kind of focus recently has been essentially trying to use Ember in weird and wonderful ways. Like this is the whole point of Empress blog, field guide, and doing all the Jamstack stuff that I've been doing recently with the Ember website. Like myself and Marco have had lots of conversations about, does Ember fit here? And I'm at the point where I'm experimenting to see if it fits here. And one of the key things that you've talked about plenty of times, and it's already in flight, is this root-based code splitting. Because if we could make loading a single root on a website a little bit lighter, then it suddenly becomes less of a pain to say, let's use Ember as the static build for this thing. Oh, but suddenly you now have to download this megabyte of JavaScript after the first initial render. And, I know there's plenty of things that are in flight, but this idea of taking what is already being worked on, is already in certain production apps, and like shipping that to everybody. I can never remember if it's Isaac Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke or somebody else that said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. Like, if every one of us in this room in our Ember apps had root-based code splitting, then the Ember world would feel just a little bit different, and it would feel more competitive. It would feel more normal in the wider JavaScript world. And like, as I said, I'm easily pleased. Like, I'm going to get this feature anyway because it's already being worked on. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
So, I guess my question is also like, do we see anything on the horizon, sort of where Ember could kind of lead the way again, like an opportunity, like I don't know, with the router when it was first introduced, or your zero build time tooling would definitely be something that would.
Yeah, that was an example in that category.
Fall in that category.
Yeah.
Preston, Tom, do you have any thoughts, sort of what like high impact things will be or could be that could be coming in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say that the way that one thing that I've learned recently working at a big technology company is I think oftentimes it's hard to know how to prioritize these more future looking things because you have the stains in the wedding dress, right? And so one thing that I've learned in this big company environment is that you just have to allocate your budget, like your engineering budget, into different buckets of like more strategic work, and then more venture bets that are like really wild and they may not pay off, right? So in the strategic category, I would definitely include like landing Embroider. That's huge. That's getting us back to table stakes. I think TypeScript, for better or worse, like TypeScript is kind of a table stakes technology. It's how many web developers are working these days. And I also think you see a really interesting kind of symmetry between the three platforms of iOS, Android, and web, which is, even though these are different ecosystems, you see them aligning around languages with more modern type systems, being Kotlin, Swift, and TypeScript, and kind of moving in the direction tentatively of React style, component-based, unidirectional data flow. So on iOS, that's Swift UI. On Android, that's Jetpack Compose. And so more in the venture category, there's two major areas that have been top of mind for me personally. Again, like I'm like the big like corporate big company sellout, and these guys are all working on like really cool like indie stuff, and I'm just in meetings all day. So I'm going to be thinking about it from a little bit different perspective. But I'll say from my vantage point, two major areas that stand out are one is this idea of component interoperability. So I think anyone who's worked at at a company that's either big enough or that has been around long enough has got into the situation where you just have a bunch of different technologies being used at once. And that creates this inherent friction where you either have to try to standardize the whole company on one technology stack, which involves like a very, very painful and kind of pointless rewrite. Like I'm sure everyone has been part of like an Angular rewrite or a React rewrite or something like that. And that kind of sucks. So I think if you look at the space that web components are trying to solve, it just feels intuitively like there must be something that we can do to not make Vue and Ember and Svelte and React be these like totally separate ecosystems, but there must be things that we can do to at least have some sort of de facto standardization that allows these things to talk to each other. And maybe it's web components. I've been talking to some folks working on the web component standards. There's like really exciting work happening there, but clearly this is not tenable. And I think especially in the enterprise space, where you're selling software that needs to be extended by third parties, or you're allowing third parties to extend your software, you simply cannot dictate a technology solution to everyone, right? So that's one area. And the other area is this idea of like multi-platform development, where like one of the things I see, I talk about at work all the time is we have these teams that really want an iOS experience and an Android experience, but they only have web engineers. And when they look at the cost of developing for each of those platforms, it's basically hire 3x the engineers that you have today. And that's just unsustainable from a cost perspective. So if we look at like, there's so much awesome work happening, but it's so unstable, right? And I think this is an area where potentially Ember could provide an answer. We see Google making a strong investment in PWAs. Service workers are very, again, kind of this untapped resource where they're very, very complex. They're hard to, like the raw capabilities are there, but actually operating one is like giving a toddler a loaded gun, right? Like it's so easy to blow your foot off. So anyway, there's like offline applications. And of course, like Ed, you've done some work in distributed applications like Web3. Like these are all really interesting areas. And that's why I think one of the big focuses in Ember in the past few years has been on unlocking experimentation, because we don't know where this is going to go. The most important thing that we can do as a framework team is give everyone the capability to extend the framework and take it, as you were saying, in like very interesting new directions. And that will allow us as a community to explore these things. And at some point we'll hit pay dirt and we can just chase after it.
Preston, anything you would like to?
Yeah. So, kind of more along the side of a developer's day-to-day, like maybe how they're like designing components. I think there could be some really interesting feature additions that they're either like already being talked about or maybe in experimentation right now. But like, and like having inline component definitions would make like encapsulating your private API much easier. And that's kind of a problem we have now with Ember apps is like everything is in this global namespace if you use the Ember CLI generate component command. So you have no way of truly protecting your private components from being used. Template imports, which has been talked about a few times before, can help with that. That also is going to do wonders for our discoverability story. And I'm really excited about that. And then kind of also along like the learning and ergonomics side, I've heard that there is desire to get rid of this in tests, which will be huge. And that will kind of couple with like strict templates and things kind of being in the same scope, like using the same JavaScript scope rules, like your template and your test will just like be able to find the thing that you define, and you don't need to use this.set or this.set properties. And then we have resources kind of in experimentation right now. Those are kind of like analogous to React's hooks, at least like if you squint, because like you need to pass like you need to pass this like dependency args structure, which is kind of like if you squint even harder going back to computeds, but it's different because it's like derived data and it's still that like pull-based data flow. But the other side of that which is related, is effects, and React has this. But like if you're doing a like a canvas, 3D UI or anything like that, you don't necessarily need a template, but you still need to react to changes in your args or changes in other tracked data. And that's where effects come in. Right now, the way people have been doing it is they'll throw like a did update modifier or helper in a template with either one div. And that's like, no one likes doing that. And then the other thing that I hear people wanting in Discord a lot are like context providers. Now this is another React concept, but it's like a service, but scoped to a DOM tree or a component tree. And that's also handy for graphics. But the advantage there is that you can have like multiple instances of them scoped to different parts of your UI. And some people think about problem solving better that way. And I think it's doable. There's a couple add-ons out there exploring that. And then lastly, error boundaries. I mentioned this in my talk, but I don't know of any experimentation going on with this right now, but it would make catching errors in the VM much, much nicer and potentially protect you from your app crashing, which can happen if you have undefined references trying to be rendered. And I think error boundaries are like an essential ergonomics win that we either need to explore or come up with something similar for. Just because the VM can be very unforgiving.
Yeah,
that's my list.
Yeah, I would riff on that bit, just saying that all kinds of improved, like really, really smart error messages and warning messages are a really underappreciated area to keep investing in. It's like, anytime that we could give a really, really clear error or warning to developers is a huge win, right? Because you're taking teaching and learning and baking it right into the software. And that just scales the knowledge out so much better than having to try to remind people about something or make them try to interpret something more confusing and know what action am I actually supposed to take when I see this? If we could just say what action to take in an intelligent way to give people choices, that's huge, right? So continuing to invest in really smart warnings and errors is very, very worth it. So that goes along with what Preston's saying. And I think it ties into some of the things I was saying that I'm excited about in terms of different environments to put code into, ones that can be really good at teaching, ones that can give really good feedback. I think that our use of, by like steadily shipping, increasing default lints as part of what everybody gets in an Ember app out of the box when you upgrade, that's been a really wonderful way to spread knowledge. Like the accessibility lints have been probably the most important leap forward in accessibility that we've been able to make. And, because just by doing the normal thing and upgrading your app, all of a sudden you get pointed out all the places in your app where you were having, potential accessibility problems in a way that already fits into people's workflow, right? So I love that kind of pattern of encapsulating teaching and knowledge into the code and using it to just give people a really delightful experience so that an error message isn't a negative experience, it's actually a learning experience. So I'm excited to keep investing in better error messages, and definitely, like, I'll reiterate what Preston said in his talk, like, please consider an error message that you found confusing or misinterpreted or just had to even Google around a lot about. That's a bug. File the bug. Let's talk about how to make it better. And a lot of times, sometimes it's not even that difficult to PR, right? Because if you go search for the message that was thrown to you and you find it in the Ember source and there's a better way to say it, that's a pretty straightforward PR to make. And those are very, very valuable for everybody else whoever who comes behind you and won't have to try to think about what that message meant.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I just want to say, because I'm not sure whether everyone is aware, but of course we do accept questions, or if you want to share like a thought on anything we talk about, so please. So we have the first one already.
Hi. So It's a bit more short term. Like I think we've been talking a bit long term. I'm very interested in Glimmer on its own. Seeing it is becoming like a separate project. You have Ember, you have Glimmer. Obviously, they're sort of mentioned in the same sentence a lot. But I'm working on something where I don't really need like routing and stuff. But I do really like a rendering engine for the browser, basically. But when I look at Glimmer documentation and stuff, I see experimental written everywhere. And I'd like to sort of see where that's going. How experimental is it? And like, what's the plan for the future in the split between Ember and Glimmer?
The story
I can answer how
go ahead,
experimental it is. So I will just, so I think that warning is there just to, to make sure people are aware that it is still an early adopter technology. However, I just want to share that all of the server-side rendered public pages at LinkedIn.com. So if you go to LinkedIn.com homepage, if you go to any of our marketing pages, on the server side, those are all rendered with Glimmer. And as of recently, the majority of emails that you get from LinkedIn are also all rendered with standalone Glimmer with no Ember at all. So I don't know if we've talked about that publicly, but we have a whole integrated rendering stack, Ember for our applications that members log into, and for guests and email, all built on Glimmer, which is that's like thousands and thousands of pages, right? And billions of requests every month. So experimental. Well, we built the business on it. Oh, So I think this is something that's very important to me as well. I think about whenever there's a lot of innovation in a space and there's a lot of disruption, you see this bundling and unbundling phenomenon, right? So I think Ember in the early days that we had some concrete answers about this is how you build a web application. And so Ember came along to kind of bundle all of those ideas together. But then you saw after that, we explored with so much new technology, GraphQL, like the React style component model, there was this unbundling so people could take all the little best bits and stitch them together themselves. And now you're seeing this next step of a rebundling. So I think of things like Next.js and Create React App, which are again trying to bundle everything together. But having this ability to unbundle is, I think, what unlocks that experimentation. So anyway, I just want to say, I agree. For LinkedIn's use cases anyway, we also share that need where you don't always need an SPA, you don't always need a router. And this is something we're using in production and are continuing to invest in.
Yeah. I was going to add that the Glimmer as a separate name from Ember, the story got more complicated because of its success, right? So it started out as like experimental possible new rendering engine for Ember that wasn't connected, but all that worked so well that now it is baked back into Ember. And so there was actually a question of is the point that it is the rendering engine, which is one way we use the word now, because like what started as a separate experiment succeeded wildly and got baked into every Ember app, right? So initially it was created to be the experimental place before things kind of came in, but it succeeded. And now there's a rendering engine called Glimmer in Ember. So the question is, should we keep the name to mean the place where we build the new thing, or is it just the rendering engine under Ember? And it's used both ways, so it's a little confusing now and I think, like I'm saying, because it's almost because of the success of that experiment worked so well that it's not just an experiment anymore. I do think that as we're delivering on all the things we've been talking about with just rationalizing the build and the tooling and the ecosystem, questions of like how do you just use the rendering engine become very much more natural. Mm-hmm. It's just, if everything wasn't glommed together in the first place, you wouldn't really have a question of how to take it back out. It would just be you wouldn't pull it in. And that's kind of the whole theme of where I'm trying to take our tooling side. So, even on current releases, it's possible for Ember to statically analyze all through what parts of Ember you're using, and if you don't use them, they won't be there. And it makes it possible to. It's going to become more practical to just say, "I've got some components. I didn't happen to put in a router, so there's not a router." That should feel natural. So I kind of feel like the question is going to help solve itself by just solving the other problems we've already talked about, where it just should be fairly natural if you just came in with no knowledge of the ecosystem and just said, what if I just want a component and I don't want a router, so I don't put one in my app, it would do the right thing. I really want to get to that place, because we don't have to invent a way and a completely separate teaching story, I don't think. So I would hope that like completely standalone Glimmer is just a natural outgrowth of, picking a slightly different blueprint when you're getting started or deleting a couple of files, and that perhaps we would still want to have a completely more experimental space for really out there stuff. And I don't know how we end up using the names to keep things clear and separate, but it is very valuable to have a place that is more free for experimentation. To Tom's point about unbundling things, it's a real art to unlock experimentation without fragmenting communities and without leaving people behind, because it's easy to push the pedal very hard on let's move as fast as possible on experiments, or let's never rake anybody's apps, and neither of those extremes is very valuable or helpful, right? It's finding the middle way. So trying to be clear on certain things, that these things are the fun areas where it's okay to take chances and it's okay to make breaking changes, is a thing I'd want to protect in the wider ecosystem of Ember. But making sure we keep the doors and channels clear between the stable parts and the experimental parts, so that experimental parts like the Glimmer VM can graduate into stable. Yeah.
I just want to quickly expand on some of the stuff that you've been saying there, Ed. Like, I remember some of the early talks that Tom would have given about Glimmer, and like, oh, it's just a separate thing. And the phrase that jumps to mind was npm install your way to Ember. Mm-hmm. And it feels like what you're saying about rationalizing the build system is exactly the same concept, just the other side of the coin. So you install Ember, and then you just don't use the parts of Ember, and then your output doesn't have all the bits that you're not using.
Yes.
So it's like, it's not
and
npm
you could model it the other way
uninstalling.
too. You could model it as npm we were install your way up to. One of the biggest frictions we deal with and everybody in JavaScript deals with is that npm frankly made a lot of bad architectural choices early on. But because package management is a network effects game, like a social network, right? You want to be on the one where everybody else is, even if they're not so great. So all of us in JavaScript are kind of stuck with npm, and it's improved over the years, but there's still some fundamental stuff architecturally that's very painful about it. I think everybody has probably had their frustrations with node modules. That is one of the things that makes just doing the literal thing of npm install your way to Ember difficult. Mm-hmm. It would have a lot of trade-offs. Like, we could very easily ship, at Ember/component and at Ember/application as a bunch of real packages on npm. But that invites a whole lot of dependency hell onto our users. Yeah. So maybe we'll do that, but maybe it's going to depend on npm fixing some bugs first, right? And getting really good support for peer dependencies, and us adding some layering of tooling on top. It's also not clear how much it helps users. If, as you're saying, like, the other way to look at it is just maybe you have fewer packages to install, but only the parts that you're using ever affect your application, and then it's not so big a deal. Then it doesn't matter so much.
It feels like you get the benefit of what the concept we were trying to communicate with npm your way to Ember, npm install your way to Ember, but without, as you say, half of this pain.
Right.
Like, in my talk, I talked about this bottled Ember thing, where it's like I essentially delete all of the things in package.json and just have my little dependency. Mm-hmm. And the same effect is true. Like, if it's not being used, it's not going to be in your output. So.
Right, exactly.
I think there was a question on Zoom as well.
Oh, sure, yeah. So the question is, can anybody speak to the future of Ember Data? I could say a bit, if anybody, unless somebody wants to jump in first. I think when I was mentioning my like high priority wish list, I kind of, obviously I think the build's important. That's why I'm working on what I'm working on. My second priority behind that would be the router, to just give it a new refresh that takes advantage of all the capabilities we have today. The one after that would be probably Ember Data, because it also could really benefit from taking advantage of things we didn't have when we last designed a lot of those APIs. An Ember Data that was, natively aware of auto tracking as its basic primitive could be much more easy to use and just fit in better with the other things we have. I think it's important. In my head, it's behind those other two priorities. Certainly, I use Ember Data in some applications I work on. I find that when you I have a curse of knowledge, of course, and a lot of the people in this room do too. But we've been doing this stuff long enough. The nice parts are very nice and don't get in your way, and you do fine. But it's true that there's other parts, there's other things you could do that are gotchas, and that don't fit, and that made sense at one point, but don't fit as well now with Octane paradigms. So I would love to see some strong iterating there. But yeah, it comes down, and I also do think that in terms of teaching Ember, and especially onboarding new people, it is, however, helpful to separate clearly in people's minds that Ember, this is how Ember works. You can start out using it and not teach all of Ember Data right away, because that's a lot of extra stuff that's not needed when you're just getting started, right? Yeah. Like in a serious application, I do think it's worth reaching for Ember Data or something similar. If you're gonna, if you've got a back in this GraphQL and you want to use Ember Apollo client, that's a nice choice too. I like Ember Orbit also. I've used that in applications. Those are all nice data layers. I think it's important that we have some really good first-class choices. And I wouldn't tell anybody that they have to use Ember Data. And I think as a teaching story, it's better to leave all three of those out. Like, don't put any in as a teaching story when people are getting started. Just show them fetch, right? And make it clear that you have control here. This is just, here's where you load data. If you just want to do fetch, you can. In a real app, or in our app here, we also use these libraries. Like, that's the next learning step. But so I like the idea of decoupling it out of the basic learning materials and pointing to it just with a little bit of separation, because I think it makes the teaching story stronger. And I believe that work's already been ongoing. Like, I think our examples do that better these days. So yeah, I think it's nice that we have a default choice of a data layer, but I think it's also important to. I think a lot of people in the past have missed the fact that it's optional, and it's totally okay not to use it if you have another technology that fits your use case better. Yeah. So beyond that, if your product is heavily invested in Ember Data, it would be awesome to talk to you about how you can help us invest in it, because it's definitely just an area where in open source, energy wins. Like, whoever's got energy to get to help push projects forward really gets to help set the vision on them. And so if you've got energy to put in Ember Data, it's only like number 3 on my list. But if it's number 1 on yours, let's talk about it, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I'd love to add something to that as well, though, because I often think about this, that if somebody wants to help with the embroider situation and the router situation, then maybe we could bump the first 2 things off your list and get you to think about Ember Data.
That too.
So, like, this idea of, if there's something in the Ember community that you want, we always need help. Like, regardless of what you're interested in, what we want you to be doing, like, all help is required. So don't feel like you don't have the context or whatever to jump in. We're here to help you get that context.
Yeah. And there's always something to do.
There's always something to do.
Anything Preston or Tom would like to add on Ember Data?
There's just a trend that I've been noticing, and I don't feel like I have, or any of us have, concrete answers here. But I think it was such a revelation to the industry to have this concept of a reusable encapsulated component that knew how to turn some structured data into a reusable UI, right? And I think so that problem has been solved pretty well. I think a lot of folks here probably work in a company where you have a design system, where you have a suite of reusable components that you use throughout your applications. And I think the next step is, okay, now this component knows how to take some data and knows how to render it into a UI. But now you, as the application developer, are somehow responsible for knowing how to fetch exactly the right data to pass into that component. And you get to a stage where it kind of damages the story about these reusable components, because now you actually still have, as the application developer, some knowledge of the internal workings of this component pushed onto you, which is, what data am I required to pass to it? So I think there's really interesting experimentation happening in the industry around, for example, co-locating GraphQL queries with a component. So you can actually truly encapsulate data fetching for that component as well. And it's truly isolated, and it's truly reusable without exposing any of the data fetching knowledge into the rest of the application. So that's again an area where I think there will be exciting experimentation in our community in the future.
Speaking of that, if anyone wants to try out Ember Data resources, it is like exactly that, co-locating your data fetching with your component. You need 325 or higher to use it, but I don't personally use Ember Data all that often, so I don't have much to add elsewhere. But if you're looking for that sort of pattern, I can hook you up.
Yeah, I do think it's an area where when we talk about router API refresh, I think it's easy. Like I think when you look at it at a surface level, and people would have kind of think about what's a first kind of strawman proposal of a new way to do routing, a lot of it can miss subtle good things about what we do have, and I want to make sure that we keep some of that capability. So, for example, if you just do all data loading literally in components the way you would do them today, without a kind of higher level static analysis of the whole application, it's very easy to create performance problems for yourself and data waterfall problems for yourself, because you're just inserting arbitrary code in between the point where you know what data you need and the point where you could have fetched it all. So I do want to see us maintain the idea that we have global visibility into the route structure and to the render tree before you start rendering, right? Because as soon as arbitrary code, as soon as one of the data fetches depends on another data fetch, you just kind of got defeated in terms of the true performance story and having waterfall loading in your stuff. And if you don't design the system well, it's very easy to create those kind of problems. So I would want to see us still have global visibility into how routes map to sections of the routing hierarchy. So you really want some kind of static understanding of what all the components that you're likely to render or could possibly render are going to want before you render them, so that you don't end up with a waterfall of data loading. So
yeah, strong +1 to that. I think you're absolutely right, Ed, that a lot of times people, to solve this problem, they just couple data fetching with rendering, and that has all the performance problems you're saying. I think that's one of the things that kind of sold me on GraphQL, is in the same way that templates let us declaratively state, like, this is what the component needs in order to render, or this is how to render this component. A GraphQL query statically co-located is something that we can extract at build time and as a compiler, move it earlier into the application lifecycle for you. But as from a development experience, you're just viewing it as a co-located concern.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
And one thing that I'd like to add to that, because one thing that I find when we have these discussions is that it can seem quite abstract. Like, what does it matter that I have to, do rendering in single pass, etc. And like me doing a lot of fastboot and Jamstack stuff, what that looks like is if you're rendering something in fastboot and saving the HTML, if your component then goes and fetches something, that render isn't in the original HTML. So you get this situation where you get a blank bit, or your HTML only renders so much, and then you have to wait for all of your JavaScript to load for then to go hit the network and then come back for the rest of that section. And again, you might think that that isn't such a big deal. If you've got an app, it's like they know it's JavaScript, it's fine. But recently with the, what do they call it, the Web Vitals, this idea of cumulative UI shift, is that what it's called? Google cares if you load the page and then wait a little bit and then suddenly change a whole section of it. And that's what it looks like in reality. And that will affect your SEO if you're using Ember in a situation where SEO matters. So it's not an abstract problem that we have to solve this correctly. It's a concrete problem. There we go, Mel, a concrete example. It's a concrete problem that will affect how far you get ranked in Google. And it's something that I've cared a lot about recently because of the Jamstack stuff that I've been doing.
Exactly.
It's like I don't want any Ember developer to pay cost for choosing Ember, like an actual cost of how much money their app can produce if it's not high enough in Google.
Right. Well, and to that point, I think that out of the box, just follow the basic guides. Instructions today do a great job, and that's part of what I'm saying. Because I think there's a natural. I was advocating before for less concepts to teach, right? Yeah. And one of the things you could argue is, well, let's not teach route as a separate concept anymore, right? Why do you have that? Let's do it all as with components. Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I actually think route is still a concept, even if it becomes something closer to a component. Yeah. It's still a somewhat special component, because you really do we want to make sure that like a user doing the simple thing out of the box gets this right. And you do have it right today. It's just that today, sometimes we know you do reach beyond only loading data in the model hook. There's definitely legit use cases for loading it in a component, but then you bring all this complexity onto yourself. Can we do a better job of handling even those cases in an elegant API that keeps you on the happy path where the SEO will be good and the performance will be good? And I think that's a great example of what I was saying about embedding really good practices into just how we do things here.
Yeah.
So that when you onboard some new developer onto your team, right? If a concern like the one you're bringing up is a fairly subtle thing. It involves asynchrony and how does the wider world, including a search engine, understand how that affects your page, right? There's a lot of embedded cultural knowledge there to do the right thing. And so can we, we as a framework really want to embed that knowledge into the code and the best practices in the docs so that we don't even have to tell you should do this for better SEO. I mean, we could certainly write that down somewhere in the docs for folks who are interested. But to just say, follow this pattern and it'll work out, right? And just the user isn't asking, how do I do this in a sophisticated way that'll make my web vitals score better? Right? The user's just saying, how do I get this thing on the page? And if the easy answer to that question, the easy thing is also the right thing, then we're succeeding.
So the thing, just to kind of wrap that idea up, is that one of the magical experiences that I like to see in Ember is somebody who maybe builds an Ember app and hasn't thought about fast boot. And as you say, they followed everything in the guides and their app looks like an idiomatic Ember application. And then somebody says, oh, have we thought about SEO? And goes, okay, I've heard about this Prember thing. And this is why I was asking you this question yesterday. Technically, you can, at the moment, install Prember and an extra little add-on that just checks what your roots are in your root list. And then it just, as part of your build, puts out the HTML. And if it's all been written like a standard, quote-unquote, Ember app, it's like an hour's job. And suddenly you've made a significant improvement to like your bottom line because you've been following the idioms of Ember. And that's one of the things that's why I care about this subtlety there.
Right.
I think we're out of time for the panel. I just want to, in the beginning I said this felt a bit like a TV debate, like pre-election, right? And I want to close the panel by doing something that they always do as well, at least they did in the ones we had in Germany recently, which is one short question with a short answer where you have only one sentence to sort of
it's the gotcha
express
question.
your thoughts. And the question is, what is the single thing that you're most excited about in the Ember community, let's say for the next year, until we meet again for the same panel in Emberfest 2022? And I would say we do the same order we had in the beginning. So starting with Chris, Ed, Preston, and Tom.
So I'm really glad you phrased it like in the Ember community. My answer is I want to see more people, as Preston said, writing blogs and talking about their experiences in Ember. I want us to just flood the airways with, here's me trying out this thing. I find it's cool. I think there are these stumbling points, and this is why, I like it. So if you don't have a blog that's talking about Ember, I've got a good tool for helping you write a blog.
Instead of touting any of my own work, I'm just going to say strict mode and all the things that go with it all the things that will make it actually really nice to use.
Preston.
Yeah, for me, I think it is something that I hope to see land in Embroider in the next year, which is that Vite PR. And I think that'll require some bits of strictness, but Vite's really cool. No bundling. I think it's gonna change people new to Ember's perceptions of Ember being old and crusty.
I'm most excited about Embroider. Embroider has been huge for us at LinkedIn, thanks to the hard work of Ed and the other folks on the team. So we already have one of our Ember applications deployed in production using Embroider, and without effectively any application code changes, load times improved just by 20%. And that's without all of the amazing optimization. So in terms of like a value proposition for a business, you upgraded this new build system and you get a 20% improvement without making your developers do a bunch of work. That's huge. And it feels like we're so close. And it's so foundational for what we want to do in the future.
Yeah, very good point.
Thank you for ending with an ad for me, Tom.
Like
you can
Chris
pay
said, right?
via
Like everybody
Ethereum or
can have it,
Bitcoin.
right? So yeah, that's the panel for this year. So I would say thanks again for the panelists, Chris, Ed, Preston, Tom. I think it was very nice having this conversation. I think it's certainly something we want to continue doing over the next years of the conference. That also concludes the conference for this year. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.